Came across a video at one point. The subject matter was decolonizing math. That was the name of the video, I suppose. It was actually very interesting, right? Because what he said was that in some cultures, I guess, they don't count to 10 the same way. At least not exactly. They don't think of the numbers as being equidistant from 10, right? So they have a logarithmic way of counting, meaning that every subsequent number is farther away from 10 than the one before it. So they don't think of 5 as being in the perfect middle between 1 and 10. And it's really just a different way of thinking about the numbers. It doesn't actually change anything about the basic laws of mathematics at play. You can think about the numbers logarithmically instead of in a straightforward manner and still do formal mathematics. In other words, at least in terms of what was basically explicitly said in the video, I think he was right that there's no reason not to kind of think critically about some of the cultural assumptions at play, even in a very hard, rigid, rational discipline like mathematics. The comments section, however, was exactly what you might expect, right? People heard decolonize math, and they sort of balked at the notion, and their initial thought was math is racist now. That was kind of how they took it. Was math is racist now? And yeah, I agree. If somebody is doing normal mathematics and somebody else sees them doing normal mathematics and says like, actually that's colonizer math, I think that's probably a bit of an overhanded way of thinking about it. You're playing your hand a little bit too hard there. So yeah, sure, obviously, don't go around calling people racist for just doing math. I think that's reasonable. But that was kind of a misread. And there's a lot of subjects like this, actually. I pulled up a formal list the other day of books on the subject. There's decolonizing health. There's decolonizing science. Decolonizing cooking. Cooking might be a good example. So I'll start with cooking, right? It used to be, right, that people would kind of just cook with vibes. You just cook with vibes, man. It was all vibes. Oh, it needs like a pinch of salt. The hell is a pinch? Different people have different size hands. What is a pinch? Put a pinch of salt in. Whatever. Is it too salty? Make it a little bit less next time. That used to be the learning process. And to this day, in the kitchen, I think people use that to some degree. Some people are more like, just throw some of this in. Just throw some of it in. And other people are more like, well, no, I need to know the exact measurements. I need to know the exact measurements of the exact recipe. It used to be more vibes-based until we started to get these big factories, right? And when we started to have national markets, we started to have national product standards because consumers wanted to know that the product that they were ordering and having shipped to their house from this company was going to be the product that they saw in the magazine. So we started to have rigid product standards. And so people started to have brand recognition. You go to a Dunkin' Donuts anywhere in the country and you're going to get the same shitty coffee. This sort of standardization then became a kind of a mentality, a kind of a logic of formal rationality, of everything needs to be deliberately, mathematically measured. And then that formal rationality infected a lot of other disciplines and a lot of other schools of thought until people started to think that you had to always think that way. And cooking is a great example of, yeah, sometimes it's useful to have measuring cups, but you don't always have to think in that way. And you can totally see somebody getting too wrapped up in formal metric fixation. That term, metric fixation, that I'm using there, comes from a book by Jerry Muller called The Tyranny of Metrics. And his basic thesis is that both in private corporations and in the government, there is an excessive emphasis on using rigid mathematical metrics to determine performance when we could use human beings and common sense more often. Did you hear that Cracker Barrel changed its logo, or did it, or something? It was all, I know, a very timely YouTube channel. It was all over the news like 6 months ago, and now that it's completely irrelevant and it has fallen out of everyone's mind, it's time for me to talk about it. Now that no one cares anymore. Yeah, regardless of whatever controversy there was or wasn't actually, or something, involving Cracker Barrel's decision or lack thereof to change its logo, let's imagine for a moment that had happened. Let's imagine for a moment that this rustic country store with a rustic country aesthetic had done something that branded itself in a little bit more of a generic kind of a way. Well, why would that happen? It happens all the time. McDonald's used to have those big colorful playhouses, but now they're a little bit more gray and drab. They're kind of modernist now, like a fancy black and white restaurant in New York City used to be. Now that's the design pattern of a McDonald's. That's strange, right? Why does that keep happening? Well, I mean, I think it's the same thing that happens with TV, the same thing that happens with movie and with cultures in general, is the attempt to minimize any kind of potentially offensive aspects. And I don't mean offensive in the sense that people are going to be like, the McDonald's Playhouse was racist or something. I mean that people have too many different preferences aesthetically. People have too many subjective preferred ideas of how to do things, and at a certain point, if you're a massive multinational company, it is easier to make a very streamlined design that nobody has any specific problems with than to have a very specific identity, than to stand out. So, the old rustic vibes of the mom and pop shops, of the country stores, go away. And you end up with the same gray, drab thing in every strip mall, everywhere, all the time. And the colorful people aren't fans of this. I don't think anyone's a fan of this. I know that, you talk to the average art student, let's say, they're not going to be a fan of the grayness of everything, and they'll blame big corporations in some sort of an abstract way, but it's kind of unclear how their political remedies would do anything to fix this, right? Like, if socialism boils down to a series of policies where you nationalize various industries and take them under government control, right? And maybe that's not all it is. I don't know. But if it does boil down to that, how would that help prevent things from being gray and standardized and boring? I think it wouldn't. This line of reasoning that says that we can think of basically every discipline as having this kind of subtle colonial mentality sticking behind it that shapes how people were thinking about it. Everything from doctors to chefs, to scientists, to musicians, to everything can have a sort of a colonized or decolonized way of looking at it. Sheet music, right? Who says that music needs to be done to sheet music? Who says that the best way to learn music is to have a formalized written system that's completely standardized, that captures what every specific note is, so that you can write down exactly what notes you're playing to exactly what tune, so that everybody else can follow you? You could argue that that is a colonial, quote-unquote, way of thinking about music. This line of critique also extends into political thought. Marxism, for example. There are several full-length books about the concept of decolonizing Marxist or socialist political thought. And unsurprisingly, there are also formal academic Marxists who criticize this thought. I'm thinking currently of people like Catherine Liu and Vivek Chibber, who have both been critics of the logic of decolonization. They see it as a part of a broader trend on the left of criticizing hierarchy of all forms, and as a result of criticizing hierarchy, making it impossible for the left to actually organize itself and be successful in any kind of real way politically. That's not what I'm here to do today. That's a developed line of thought, and I think it's a very interesting line of reasoning. I think they make some good points, but that's not what I'm here for. What I'm here to point out is something very different. I'm here to point out that the people criticizing the McDonald's rebrand of being very gray and drab range from the libertarian left to the authoritarian right. There are, fascists is a pretty good word for them, Nazis, people on the far right, something of that ilk, more or less, who have this same exact line of reasoning. They would call it modernity rather than colonial thought, but they're saying the same thing. They're saying that our modern world has been made into one gray, drab thing. That a process of globalization, which some of them would blame on Jews. Either way, they would say that this process of globalization has caused these massive multinational corporations to dilute the various distinct cultures that they operate within the territories of, and have made one global culture that contains no parochialness, no uniqueness, no creativity. It is what happens when you take all kinds of different cultures and average them together. You end up with nothing specific and nothing cultural. One of the slogans of these far-right people is reject modernity, embrace tradition. And they usually assume that the traditions being embraced are going to be like, I don't know, a 1950s sock hop with very strict American gender roles, and everybody's sipping milkshakes, and we're back to the good old days of doo-wop music, or something like that, right? But there's no reason you can't take that same exact line of reasoning and pull back to an even older tradition. For some people on the far right, this is paganism, right? They reject Christianity as overly modern and go back to even older animistic religions like pagan religious thought. But for people on the left, this might be indigenous cultures, which a lot of people on the left have a lot of respect for. They view them as fundamentally egalitarian, and they also would kind of view that as a kind of proto-communism. Marx, after all, pointed to indigenous cultures. He didn't say, like, hey, this is what communism will be. It'll be exactly like indigenous cultures. But he did say, there was a kind of a different way of living, and you can kind of see a kernel of what we might become after capitalism in these indigenous ways of life. And I think a lot of people on the left ever since then have been looking back to indigenous people and saying, like, how can we imagine something beyond this? How can we imagine something beyond today? The only example we can kind of think of to kind of get there is, what if it's like indigenous people, but with modern technology? I think that on a basic level, all of these thinkers, regardless of whether they're coming from the far right or the left or an academic background, or they're just kind of crassly thinking it in art or expression, they're all kind of circling one idea. That there's something about colonial modernity, the modern world, something about all of that that is one thing, and it's overly formal, and it's overly rigid, and it's almost tyrannical, and it rules without a king, without any kind of a power structure, and it makes things boring. It makes things gray. And I don't like things to be boring. What is the central focus of the channel? What is the thing that I'm always circling around, right? Liquid democracy. What do I say liquid democracy does? It's not just a proposal for how to change our democratic institutions. It's a proposal that makes things less boring. It allows for all of these different diverse political interests to be represented. It allows for people with idiosyncratic views that don't fall within the two-party system to express those views fully and completely without having to be a part of a group in order to fit in. This would be the exact opposite of the modernist logic of democracy. That is, after all, what is being criticized here. Democracy didn't always look like this. When the founders started coming up with their ideas of democracy, parties were only supposed to play a very small role. It was only with the emergence of industrial capitalism that political parties started to play a bigger role in democracy and in how our politics worked. Political parties started to shape our views more and more. It is a fiercely modern form of democracy that we are practicing. And what I am suggesting is a movement to a different kind of democracy that undoes that basic problem. If you knew it, I knew you would be angry too. Do 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 do. I said, it's your